Welcome back to another episode of the Higher Love with Megan podcast, talking all things mind, body, soul, healing and expansion with me, your host, Megan Cooper. If you are returning to this space, please do take a moment to rate the show, or you can head to Apple Podcasts to leave a review, all of which enables more people to find me and for me to connect with more great guests each week for both yours and my enjoyment. If you're new here, welcome, and it's great to connect, celebrating you for dedicating your time to self-discovery and reconnection. Our time is our greatest commodity and gift, so thanks for investing it in yourself and sharing it with me. Up on the podcast this week, we have Jonny Miller. Jonny is an emotional resilience researcher, host of the Curious Humans podcast, and founder of Nervous System Mastery, a cohort-based course for cultivating calm and agency over your internal state. His work seeks to rewire your neurobiology with evidence-backed protocols and equip you with a personal toolkit to upgrade resilience, calm, and increase aliveness. I personally consider Jonny to be a nervous system wizard. I met Jonny years ago when we were both living in Canggu in Bali and always regarded him as, fittingly for his podcast show, a very curious human with broad knowledge and experiences to share, thought-provoking questions asked, interesting and considered reflections provided when in conversation with him. His exploration and deep diving into the human experience has and continues to inspire and intrigue me. And a year ago, my partner Casper and I joined Jonny's second cohort of Nervous System Mastery. We were both amazed by the profound change it brought to us, individually and as a couple, and were humbled and captivated by the amount that we didn't know about something essential to our own experience of life as our own nervous systems. Such transformational work is so needed in a world of commonplace dysregulation, chronic stress, burnout, anxiety, depression, and an increased intrigue in coming back to the body, healing in a deeper way and understanding ourselves more fully. As a result, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation with Jonny and being able to share all of his wisdom with us on this topic. Amazing. Well, very excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much, Jonny. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, so you have a very interesting personal story, and I've had snippets of your personal story through, I suppose, shared experiences of sitting in the sauna in Bali, where you usually hear about 15 minutes worth of somebody's story and then you have to leg it out.
I've got to go.
Don't want to leave, but I have to literally leave. I'm cooking. But I've heard snippets of your personal story and also from what you've shared in your own podcast, how that has brought you into this path of self-discovery and the human experience. So can you share some of your story with us of what brought you here today?
Well, I left school really not knowing what the hell I wanted to do in life, and I ended up saving up and going on a big gap year, an adventure around the world. And I'd say those 11 months really shapes me, and I think kind of stretched my mind and imagination in really healthy ways, and kind of instilled this love of travel and adventure and curiosity about other cultures and different lenses through which we kind of see the world. And yeah, and I fell in love with travel. And after graduating from university, I studied philosophy and economics. Two friends and I started a travel company called Maptier, which was, I think the tagline was the most inspirational map in the world. And the idea was to kind of convey this love of like the world really through the lens of travel, of like fascination, cultural pieces as well. And then about a few years into that, I went through a burnout. I kind of realized I didn't enjoy what I was doing on a daily basis. And that was kind of like my first kind of identity crisis, like existential crisis. I then ended up going into teaching entrepreneurship, weirdly enough, in London, which I really enjoyed. And then this was about 5.5 years ago now, my fiance at the time, who was suffering from bipolar, she had an anxiety attack and pretty kind of out of the blue ended up taking her own life and overdosing on her own medication. And that kind of threw me into, well, first initially shock, but kind of grief. And that journey really it was really like my biggest teacher in many ways, and it opened me up to just this like inner emotional landscape that I'd been quite detached from, I think. And even though I'd been very curious about the world, a lot of that curiosity been directed outwards, like learning things, new ideas, intellectual things that hadn't really been very embodied. And so I think my journey from that point onwards really kind of directed the lens of curiosity inwards, and started exploring things like meditation, breath work, plant medicines, somatic work, and kind of the work that I'm now doing around emotional resilience and the nervous system. And so I'd say that's like the broad arc of the last decade or so.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And what was it about the nervous system that really grabbed you? Because obviously now you are creating these incredible courses, nervous system mastery. And what was it that when you landed on that, you were like, right, this is something that people need to know about? What was it about that grabbed you the most?
I think it was this sense of like, there's this David Foster Wallace quote where he tells a story of two fish, and one fish swims past the other and says, "How's the water?" And the other fish is like, "Wait, what's water?" And I think for me, the nervous system was kind of like that. And I'd been doing all of these things, from breath work to meditation, and learning how to change my state, and these things. And in one moment, it kind of clicked that like all of these changes originate in the nervous system, and how our perception of reality is completely filtered through the state of our nervous system. And what many of these different modalities have in common, whether it's breath work, whether it's taking psychedelics, whether it's meditation retreats, they are all ways of kind of consciously or unconsciously augmenting the nervous system. And I was like, wow, there's like really something here. And the more that I dug into it, and learning specifically about polyvagal theory through my breathwork training, where they talk about the two branches of the parasympathetic nervous system, I was like, wow, there's so much here, and it's also so directly applicable and practical to day-to-day life. And so that's kind of where I was like, I just want to see how deep this rabbit hole goes.
And I mean, I'd say that the nervous system is really only something that's kind of come onto my radar in the last couple of years, I would say, even though it's so embedded into our language. When we talk about getting on my nerves, or feeling, even just, getting nervous, it's in our language, but yet it's not really something that I gave much airtime to, or, really kind of dug that deeply into. So for somebody listening who's not really that familiar with the language around nervous system, what is our nervous system, and why should we care about it?
Well, what is our nervous system? We are continuously receiving sensory inputs through touch, sight, sound, like vibrations in the airwaves between you and I. Like, it's pretty amazing, really, that you're making movements with your mouth that is sending vibrations through the air, and then that is coming through satellites and into my ears, and then my nervous system is interpreting that and making meaning and sense out of it. Like, it's pretty incredible. And in terms of like, why does it matter, and why is it relevant? I think there's a couple of things. Like, the first is that many people feel like they are in some ways victims, or victims of the state of their nervous system, where their body will respond in a certain way which isn't ideal to the situation. So it's common for people to talk about, like, limbic hijack, where they're in a fear response, or they're shut down, or they're feeling really anxious before they're about to give an important talk, and it feels like these states aren't really conducive to their intention. And so what I love to teach and love to share is that by both identifying when we're kind of overly upregulated, or kind of shut down, and overly downregulated, there are pretty simple kind of physiological interventions, things we can do, breathing practices, which will bring us back into what's known as within our window of tolerance. So within this window where we feel like we have more choices, more agency, more freedom. And that what I found is that this really gives people a lot more like confidence and conviction. And I've had students talk about, they feel more confident to like ask girls out on dates, or like say the thing that they wanted, because they know that even if they do kind of go outside of their window, so to speak, and get a little bit anxious, they can kind of come back down again. They won't be stuck there, and it's not they're not victims to that. And it kind of goes against this idea of, in the 60s it was called the autonomous nervous system, because it was thought to be completely automatic. It was thought that we didn't have any control over it, but it turns out that that was wrong, and that we do. And that specifically things like the breath and also the visual system, which is directly connected to the nervous system, are ways that we can shift and augment, usually up or down, the nervous system, in order to feel more like honestly present and more alive as well. And it's also very relevant for people who have been through maybe a burnout experience, or they're experiencing intense emotions and looking to kind of work with those. And for me as well, it's almost like a way of it connects to being more embodied, and having what's known as interoception, which is like listening to the feedback from our bodies the entire time, whether it's around decision making, whether it's around like, do we have a weird feel around a certain person, around a project, and actually listening to our bodies, as opposed to the way in which I was certainly conditioned, which was kind of like a top down, like ordering my body what to do. Like if I'm tired, it's like, no, like my brain's like, body, do this. It's like this mental override that really isn't good for us, especially in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. And burnouts come up a couple of times when you've been explaining this stuff. And how do you explain burnout in relation to the nervous system, through your own experience? And I know that a lot of people experience burnout. My partner has experienced burnout in a big way. And how would you explain the correlation between burnout and the nervous system?
Yeah, well, I'm actually writing an essay on this right now, so great timing.
Great.
Thank you for the question. There are a few ways to talk about this. From the kind of scientific biological standpoint, when we go through a stressful experience, and that could be something like, as extreme as like a car crash or an accident or a surgery, whatever it is, the body produces adrenaline, and it initiates what's known as like the stress cycle. It's like a mobilization reflex, like mobilizing for energy. I'm gonna like run away from a tiger, whatever it is, and there's all of that energy in the system. And if that doesn't get a chance to be completed, and by that I mean that if the nervous system doesn't downshift into some form of relaxation or parasympathetic state, then that activation energy will kind of get stored and buffered for later, to be digested later. And there are times when we can't, drop into parasympathetic in the moment, because it's just not appropriate or it's not possible. So it's a very useful mechanism. But if enough of this like stress energy gets stored, it creates what I call emotional debt, or in the technical term, it can actually be measured as allostatic load, which is like a measure of chronic stress in the system. And the more of this allostatic load that builds up, the more that it creates fragility in the nervous system, and it means that we're more likely to have like a smaller window of tolerance. So we'll be more likely to go into anxiety, or down into depression, or into overwhelm, down into shutdown. And dysregulation, usually there's various reasons that it can occur, but the main one is that there's so much of this kind of unmetabolized, incomplete like stress reflex that builds up in the system and doesn't get released, and that causes dysregulation. And burnout is ultimately one of the ways that can manifest. It can also be health conditions, depression, things like that. Like burnout manifests in different ways. And yeah, I also talk about like a kind of a feather brick dump truck metaphor, where often our bodies will give us like, it's almost like a tickling with a feather. It's like, hey, like pay attention, like something's not right here. And then some people will ignore it, push past it, and then there'll be a brick. And maybe, they feel exhausted for a day. And then the dump truck is they wake up one morning and they're like, oh shit, I'm burnt out. Like I can't get out of bed. I'm blah, blah, blah. And that can last for weeks or months, or, even longer.
And I guess this is so relevant to so many people in, our modern lives, because what you're saying is our nervous system's built to, upregulate and then have a period of coming back down again to kind of balance back out. But actually, modern life doesn't necessarily facilitate that for a lot of people, because we're constantly having this extreme influx of stimulation. And actually, the nervous system wasn't really designed for that, because the nervous system was built and honed a long time ago, whereas modern life has changed significantly since then, right?
Yeah, I mean, I recently interviewed a guy called Kevin Kelly on my podcast, and he said this great phrase where he was like, most of us understand the idea of having a good work ethic, but what we need is an equal rest ethic. And I think, to your point, many of us, we kind of, we'll drink the coffee in the morning, we'll do the Wim Hof breathing, we'll get like amped up, but then we don't prioritize the downshifting as much as we're prioritizing the kind of activation energy. And particularly if you're someone who lives in a city where there's a lot of like sensory sounds, lights, stimulation coming in all different forms, it can be very hard for the body to actually relax at the end of the day, hence requiring things like alcohol or weed, or the various kind of substances that we use. They're known as defensive accommodations in the literature, and they're basically like crutches that the nervous system will draw on in order to kind of claim its downshifting that it needs. And we can, it's also, it's almost like you can think of it as like a muscle. We have what's known as vagal tone, and the stronger our vagal tone, the more our capacity to downshift after a stressful event, which is basically a form of resilience, right? If you have something stressful, how quickly can you downshift into relaxation and like exhale? And you can even track in your system when that downshift's happening. There's often like maybe a yawn or a sigh, or like a there's that sense of like, like I'm good, I'm home, I'm safe. And that's another piece of it as well, is the embodied safety piece. It's very hard for the nervous system to actually downshift if it doesn't feel safe. Intellectually, you might know you're safe, but the body might not actually feel it. So yeah, there's a lot there, and I think that people are starting to wake up to this. That things like yin yoga are becoming more popular. Non-sleep deep rest, thanks to Andrew Huberman, is becoming a thing. So people are kind of understanding it, but it's still, I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah, the non-sleep deep rest was something that really came to me through your nervous system mastery course. Kelly doing the guided meditations on it. Oh,
no, yeah, she has a great voice.
Glorious. A misconception that I had about my nervous system, or the nervous system, was that we should be in regulation all the time. But actually, that's not how the nervous system was designed, right? We're always going kind of in and out of regulation. But actually, the nervous system mastery is about creating that fluidity and bringing in the techniques, the tools to give ourselves the freedom to bring ourselves out of it. Is that a misconception that a lot of people have, that actually we should be regulated, or is it something that you come across?
Yeah, I think it is. I think that it's funny, like a lot of people are chronically dysregulated, and they also have this belief that they should be fully regulated all of the time. And so there's also a piece around, I think it's very important that we build capacity in the nervous system. And what that means is inevitably like being right on the edge of our window of tolerance or slightly beyond, and then coming back into safety. I mean, it's the same way that we grow muscles, right? Like you go to the gym, you find the weight that's like just the right amount where you push to failure, and then you're like, oh, and then you rest for like a day and your muscle repairs and regrows stronger than it was before. It's the same with the nervous system. We actually want to be like testing it and growing in that way.
Yeah.
But I think, like you say, that the ideal is, in my opinion, kind of dynamism, where the nervous system will respond appropriately to whatever the circumstance is. So I don't know, to give an extreme example, if like aliens landed tomorrow and there was like all out war, you wouldn't want to be this like calm home, like completely you'd want to have some like activation energy there, because and there probably would be some, I would imagine, like being outside of your window of tolerance. But the important thing is that you realize that's what's happening. It's not sustainable, and you're able to come back down and rest when it's necessary.
Yeah. Could you just explain what these different nervous system states are? Because I feel like we're going into kind of talking about the different states. So yeah, could you just explain what those are and how that tends to feel for us?
Yes. So I'll briefly explain the window of tolerance, because I think people can probably relate to that quite easily. That's if you imagine almost like your energy, your activation on the x-axis, like going up. There's a certain point where it's like, oh, I feel alert, I feel awake, like right now I feel kind of engaged, this is awesome. And then, you know, maybe if I drank like 3 extra espressos, I'd be like just outside my window and I'd be too stimulated and I'm like, oh shit, I'm shaking. And that's the window of tolerance, like that end. And then on the other side, on the kind of the relaxation side or the parasympathetic side, we can also, you know, it's great to be in a state of deep rest, but then there can also be kind of lethargy, there can be shutdown, there can be the collapse, there can be what's known as the freeze response, which is kind of a survival strategy in extreme circumstances. This will sometimes happen if we spend too long in like outside of our kind of activation window. There's like a fuse that trips and we shut down and we kind of collapse. And this is sometimes where, you know, someone at work might just like burst into tears and then just like need to go home and go to sleep. That's kind of the what's known as the dorsal fuse going in. And then I'll briefly just kind of share that this is like a very high level summary of what's known as polyvagal theory, which there's a lot that it says, but essentially there are 2 branches of the parasympathetic nervous system. One branch is known as vagal or ventral vagal, one is known as dorsal. And all you need to know really is that the ventral vagal is associated with feelings of like connection, play, like making eye contact, embodied safety is kind of what it represents. It's like healthy social connection. So like strong ventral vagal is great. We want that as much as possible. And then the dorsal is sometimes known as like the handbrake or like the emergency brake. And in a healthy situation, this helps us to like really downshift, relax. You know, at the end of an NSDR, we might be in kind of like low tone dorsal. And in extreme circumstances, it's also what comes in as almost like a kind of like the safety fuse in a way, where it will cause this shutdown or this collapse. And if you're someone who has ever been in a confrontation or a fight and you felt yourself just like go maybe numb, like closed off, you've withdrawn, or you've even completely frozen, that's the dorsal kind of like kicking in. And in order to kind of come out of that in a healthy way, there are various practices for what's known as thawing the dorsal response. So it's almost like you're kind of unfreezing that dorsal response. So in order to thaw, there usually needs to be some movement, some sound, some breath, some more energy needs to kind of go into the system to kind of bring that back online. And from there, whatever caused the initial stressor needs to be kind of like integrated. So hopefully does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does that resonate?
Absolutely, totally. And the dorsal was really the thing that spoke to me personally most, because one aspect of my nervous system that I've always struggled with is that when something becomes too much for me, maybe there's a big crowded room and I'm not feeling that confident, or lots of people I don't know, or about to do something that I'm feeling a little bit nervous about, I would dissociate quite easily. So it feels like I'm literally stepping outside of my body and then looking at myself, which is a very difficult, challenging experience, not particularly enjoyable. And me coming back into my body might take a few hours, might take a few days. Sometimes in really extreme circumstances in the past, years ago, it might have taken weeks, which is not a particularly enjoyable experience to be living your life at. But I know that a lot of people do experience that. And it was really informative for me to understand that my nervous system was ultimately just trying to keep me safe. And that's such an important aspect around the nervous system, this safety piece, because it's there to keep us safe, right? Ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful reflection. I mean, if you think of like, I rewatched a video of an impala being chased by I think it was a leopard. And like, if you imagine like you were in the jaws of a leopard, you kind of want that dissociative response to kick in. Like you don't want to be feeling that. and even, you know, even things
Quite
like
happy to sit that one out.
right. And things like, ketamine journeys, which are now becoming a lot more popular, like that is a dissociative. Like part of the therapeutic benefit is that it does cause this kind of separation between yourself and what you're perceiving as yourself. So I think the key is it's not a bad thing. It can be helpful in certain situations. What is essential is that if it's happening kind of when it's not really most useful, that you're able to kind of come back into your body, like you were saying, and learning how to like notice when it's happened, and then just have some practices for like grounding, coming back in, whatever it is that helps you. What does help you, out of interest? Like if that happens, like as we were talking, like how would you try and like pull yourself back in?
It doesn't happen so much anymore. I think just as I've come into more safety in general in my life, by which I mean feeling very grounded in my life with a very strong and stable living environment, a great community, really strong friendships, alignment in my work, a really strong, healthy partnership. And I mean, those things are all external, but I think internally too, having done quite a significant amount of deep inner healing work, subconscious based, nervous system based, somatic based, and finding deeper healing on that level and creating more safety within myself. And I think too, that feather, brick, dump truck analogy, having more awareness of when I am starting to feel maybe a little bit of a build-up of tension, and then being able to down-regulate as opposed to then letting the dump truck arrive. It doesn't happen as often, but when it does, just going slow in general life so that I'm not adding in any more additional stress. But just gentle soaring practices, a bit of movement, grounding is always good. Breath work. I mean, I know that we'll probably discuss these more, but those are the things that really work for me. And just reminding myself of the safety aspect, I find, is very, very key. Instead, I think in the past, it would really annoy me when I would go into this state, and then I would almost pile on the extra pressure. But now understanding that my body's trying to keep me safe, and then just slowly guiding myself out of that somatically, not adding on any more mental pressure. Yeah, I found that those are the best things that work for me.
Beautiful.
How much of our responses are really laid down in early childhood? Because a lot of narrative around the nervous system is, well, the nervous system is dictated very, very early on in life, and you can't do very much about it because so much of it is really ingrained. I've heard that going around, but what you've said during the course of this conversation is actually we can really develop our capacity, and we get to kind of take our we get to kind of take our power back in a lot of situations. So how much is already preordained, let's say, and how much can we work on that now?
Yeah, it's entirely preordained, and there's nothing you can do.
End of. Goodbye.
Yeah, that's sorry, tough luck. Yeah, I mean, it is true that in the first 7 years of development, like a huge amount of that kind of like foundational wiring is kind of done or put in. And it's also true that the kind of the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, which has been studied a lot in the context of the brain. Well, it turns out that the nervous system is basically just an extension of the brain. There's no kind of clear separation between the two. And the nervous system as well is incredibly neuroplastic. So the key question or invitation is how can you create states of heightened neuroplasticity in order to rewire some of these things, which again previously were thought to have been relatively fixed. And there have been studies on the neuroplastic effect of certain psychedelics. I think iboga or ibogaine was the most intense and the most long lasting, and it's been referred to as almost like fresh powder snow, kind of like dropping in the pistes so that you can rewire them again. But you don't need to go to an ibogaine clinic. There are breath work as well is another really powerful way of accessing very heightened states of neuroplasticity whenever you have any kind of like felt emotion, particularly crying, anger. There's also a lot more neuroplasticity in the system as well. I think it's also why we remember the kind of emotional component of how certain people make us feel, or how in movies we're just wired to remember feelings, and it's because that's when we're in this much more malleable state, I guess. And it's been shown that there are practices we can do to improve this ventral vagal tone, which is around increasing embodied safety, which is really the kind of like the core thread to a lot of this. Even if people don't realize it, it is the body looking for safety, essentially.
So what tools and practices do you have for your own nervous system that you've developed and that you now teach clients too?
Yeah, so I've structured the training in there's kind of three main pillars. You know this obviously. The first pillar is interoception, which is this idea of, it's a fancy way of saying being aware of your felt sensations in your body. Everything from like how fast your heart is beating to where your breath is to tension to the quality of your awareness. All of those things are interoception. The second piece are the more kind of practical levers or tools for either up-regulating or down-regulating, depending on where you're at. So the common ones that I like to share are things like alternate nostril breathing, having an exhale that's twice as long as the inhale, which is very calming. Doing this weird thing called vu hum, where if you make this like long toning sound all the way to the end of your breath, it has this increases nitric oxide and has this very pronounced calming effect on the body. That's one of my favorite ones. The sigh, the physiological sigh, where you kind of take a full breath in, like like that also really helps to calm down. And then there's some of the more energizing, activating ones as well, like the bellows breath is a good example. I'm not a fan of Wim Hof per se, because I think it's actually too intense with the forced exhale and people can pass out. It's actually too stimulating. It would be like, you know, snorting cocaine instead of having an espresso. Don't quote me on that, but I think it is actually too, in my opinion, too activating for many people, especially if they have small windows of tolerance. And I've met many people that have been dysregulated through doing Wim Hof consistently. But things like a rapid exhale through the nose for 30 breaths can have just as a kind of helpful effect. Also working with the body movements, yoga, like asana practice was basically designed to augment the nervous system to prepare it for meditation. So the traditional sequence was you do the postures, you do some forward folds that would calm you down, you then do some breath work, and you then be ready to meditate. Essentially, that was what yoga was mostly designed for. Yeah, and then there's also the third pillar, which is around what I call emotional fluidity, which is essentially welcoming and kind of being willing to feel the full spectrum of emotions, whatever's coming up. And most people, in my experience, say anger and sadness, a lot of people are comfortable feeling one of those two, but not both. And so whichever one you're less comfortable or is less common for you to express, that's something to kind of to work with. And this can be very helpful to have an experienced practitioner, someone trained in somatics to work with you. But it's also something we can practice and explore on our own as well. So I have a practice I call somatic surfing, which is basic. It's a form of somatic experiencing where you're kind of bringing to mind a memory that maybe has like a 3 out of 10 in terms of like emotional charge. So not like super triggering, but also you feel something. And then identifying what is the felt sensation that's associated with that emotion. And then being curious about that and exploring it, welcoming it, noticing if it shifts, breathing into it. And more often than not, if we can kind of drop whatever the story about the emotion is and just get into our body, the emotion will begin to move and shift. And usually there'll be some kind of like some resistance is kind of moved through, and there's this like expansiveness, freedom, connection on the other side. And that's ultimately, I think, like the deeper work that a lot of this is pointing to. And we have to have a certain degree of embodied safety and interoceptive awareness to engage in the more deeper emotional work.
So what I'm hearing that for most people, it's this combination of kind of a longer term project of managing the nervous system kind of daily, whether that is a yoga practice, breathwork practices, a combination between work rest. You know, we have these longer term things, but then also this additional toolkit of when the fire alarms go off, like emergency toolkit. Is that right?
Yeah, I like that. I'd say there's maybe even a third category. So there's like the daily practices, which are just like, you know, like brushing your teeth, like nervous system hygiene. Actually not used that phrase before, but I quite like it.
I love it too. It's
like
great.
that's kind of what it is. Like you brush your teeth every day, you have a shower most days, kind of the same with the nervous system, just things to like bring you back into baseline and also increase your capacity over time.
Yeah.
Then there are the kind of the real-time pieces of during the day, someone says something that makes you angry, frustrated, whatever it is, then like coming back down into, again, kind of regulation into within the window of tolerance. And then I think there's actually a third category as well, which is like when you're feeling regulated and grounded and safe, kind of intentionally going into something that is challenging, triggering, because underneath every trigger is basically more self-awareness and more freedom underneath. Like it's almost always a signpost to some incomplete reflex from our past which hasn't been fully felt and integrated. So we've like exiled this part of our psyche and often become numb in a certain area, and it's a way of becoming more whole essentially. And you know, that work can be engaged in on a, you know, weekly basis, a monthly basis, various different ways of doing it. But it's important to kind of, I think, give space to integrate between sessions, especially if they're very intense, because it does, again, take a while for the new wiring to be kind of like set in.
Yeah, I think that was very, very transformational for me. This idea that triggers are not something to be fearful of. I mean, it's not enjoyable, let's say, when they come up, but actually to go into it with that mindset of, oh wow, there is a gift here for me, because now I can come to understand why this is upsetting me, why this is making me angry. Because you're right, it's that kind of psychic wounding from the past, that disconnection that we have within ourselves. And when we take that mentality into the trigger to go deeper into that level of self-inquiry, you know, there's almost like nothing that can phase us when we're going in with that kind of mentality.
Oh,
is that something that's happened for you doing this work?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think if that idea was widespread around the world, I think the world would be a very different place. Because most of the pain and suffering that we see is people running away from their triggers and projecting their pain onto the other, whatever the other happens to be. And it has been transformative for me. In breathwork training, they have this phrase of like, take it to the mat. And it's like, breathwork is obviously the way of processing it in this context. And so it's like, oh, and I got to the point, especially during the training, where I was like, I noticed there was one point where the teacher, I like wanted to take notes on my iPad, I think it was, and he basically like made this rule of like no technology that felt like it was like very directed at me, and I felt this like shame response come up, and it kind of reminded me of like being at school and being punished as a kid, all those things. And then pretty like within a few minutes I was like, oh, interesting, I'm about to do a breathwork journey, this is going to be fun. Like I'm going to get to like heal a part of myself. And that's exactly what happened, and it turned out to be a very profound journey. And so, not that I get this right all the time, but there is definitely a part of me that has this kind of like meta awareness where you know, let's say I'm having a conflict with Kelly, with my wife. There's this part that's like, fuck you. And there's also this part that's like, I'm really interested to see what this is going to be connected to. And it's like those parts are there at the same time. And the more presence that I have, the more that I'm able to allow the curiosity to kind of run the show, and then, you know, lie down, do a somatic journey, whatever it is, and actually explore what's there. But it's so freeing. And once you've been through this cycle a number of times, you do start to just have confidence through experience that, oh, like this actually means that there's something that I haven't looked at, and there's something here for me to feel into.
I would love to come back to that, to the example that you gave around with Kelly and how nervous system has impacted relationships. I'd love to come back to that. And I was having a little giggle because I can definitely see myself in that same conversation. Something comes up for Casper, a trigger, or something comes up for myself. You know, we have that kind of dance of being in the moment with it, and then also that meta conversation of But how familiar is this for you? It's like, oh God, you have two coaches living together. So I would love to come back to that. I just have a question around, in this work, when you were diving into the nervous system and going deep with that on your own journey, and then coming to a place of wanting to teach this stuff, was there anything that surprised you in your own personal experience, and then also in the theory around it? Was there anything that surprised you?
Yes. Yes. I was shocked by the way in which the body knows what to do, and the intensity of, or initially perceived intensity of what can come through a body that is looking to basically just like relieve this emotional debt, kind of complete these incomplete reflexes, but through being present and kind of like holding space in breathwork circles and also one-on-one journeys, the like people would be blown away. And I'd love for there to be a documentary at some point that was, you know, tastefully filmed, that actually like shows what happens in these states. But I remember seeing there was a guy who relived a drowning experience, and another lady who was taking part in the training who had a surgery, and her entire body was just like the leg starts to shake. And it's almost like I think the best metaphor is if you're a hunter and you're like tracking an animal, you kind of like track the sensations. Like in the beginning, we'll like unweight a limb just ever so slightly, just like take the weight off, and then it might start to, a finger might twitch, and then maybe the hand twitches, and then the hand twitch turns into like the arm starts to move, and then that will go down somewhere else into the hip, and then some emotion will come through. And it's like this like incredible like dance that's beautiful, that's complex, and it's also incredibly compelling to witness as well. And you can actually see, this is kind of interesting, and it is relevant for like interpersonal challenges as well. You can see when someone is just like allowing their body to do what it needs to do, and then you can see when they go into storing it in their mind, because there's this like this aliveness and the kind of compelling intrigue that you have watching this process unfold, almost like hits pause. One of my teachers, Rick, says it's like you notice yourself just like wanting to go off and make sandwiches, even though you should be holding space for this person. It's like the interest and the aliveness kind of fades away. And so I think, yeah, I've just been fascinated by the ways in which the body actually already knows what it needs. It's just, how do we get out of the way so that it can kind of heal itself? And I think it's also a very empowering perspective to take, in contrast with the, you know, the mainstream medical model, where you go to a doctor who fixes you, who gives you pills, who does the things that are external to you that you then ingest or you receive, and that's the thing that heals you. But actually, what I've seen is that the body really knows how to heal itself, and all we're doing is creating the conditions of safety, and almost like poking and prodding in the right way for the body and the breath to kind of do their thing.
And so much of what you've mentioned, even these tiny little cues of yawning or sighing, they're very natural, but yet they're things that we would perhaps think of as impolite. You know, we're taught that if you yawn when somebody's speaking, that it's
weird,
you know,
right?
that it means that they're being
weird.
boring. But actually, I take it as a real compliment now. You know, if I'm doing a session with somebody or doing a movement practice and someone's yawning away, I'm like, great, you know, it's the best thing. And also with the body, you know, when we shake when we are releasing, when, you know, the body's in a state of shock, because we're trying to, you know, discharge tension from the body. But yet, if you see someone who's extremely, you know, anxious, and they're, you know, and they're shaking, we'll kind of want to put our hands on them and be like, oh, don't shake, you don't need to be shaking. And we think that that's the soothing. So it's interesting that this keeps coming up around this like the body's intelligence in those cues that we have decided are not the right way for the body to be.
Yeah, I'll give a really interesting practical example, which was my teacher Ed told a story where he was in a scooter accident in the streets in Bali, very dangerous roads, and I think it was like late at night. And basically he was like, he was by the side of the road. Someone else had like picked him up, and someone wanted to take him to hospital. And there was this talk of like anesthetic, which obviously like interrupts that natural response. And he was able to just like shake by the side of the road for like 15 minutes or so. And then after that was done, very much like the video of the impala that gets chased by a leopard, he was fine. Like his body had just like completely released all of that nervous system energy. But like you say, that's not only kind of not encouraged, it's actively inhibited, whether it's through shaming, through like, no, don't do that, or through anesthetic, which literally just like numbs and knocks people out. So I do think that, yeah, there's so many cultural norms that aren't conducive to the body doing what it needs to do.
Yeah, Peter Levine talks about this a lot, and I remember listening to a story that he gave of being in a car crash. I think he was knocked over by a car, and he talks about whilst waiting for the ambulance to arrive, there was a woman there who just kind of put her hand gently on him, nothing that she could do, but just said, "Don't worry, I'm not going anywhere, and I'm just going to be here with you." All words to that effect. And he said, fundamentally, he thought that saved his life, because in that moment, all we're needing is just connection, just to feel safe and to feel connected, rather than to have any kind of interference in the process.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story, and he was definitely one of the pioneers of this work. In his book Waking the Tiger, I think was the first book. Yeah, really recommend for listeners if they're curious to hear some crazy stories about how this works.
Yeah, amazing work. There's another aspect that I'd love to explore. What is the connection between the nervous system and our mental landscape? Because this also was revolutionary to me in your course, that sometimes when our inner critic takes over, or our mental landscape, coming out with our whatever it tends to be, the negative self-talk, sometimes that's not necessarily just the mind doing its thing. That's actually a state of dysregulation that then has a specific language that then tells the story within the mind. That was really revolutionary to me, because then when I could hear myself, hear the thoughts, and then be like, oh, okay, I know this isn't a mind thing. I know my body just needs to be taken care of in a different way. So can you just speak a little bit to that connection?
Yeah, so I find this incredibly fascinating. I also want to kind of preface this by saying that there isn't much, if any, kind of peer-reviewed research data on this. This is purely from my own experience and what I've noticed. But I have a hypothesis, or a sense, that different nervous system states are like correlated to different internal parts. So kind of through the lens of internal family systems, this idea that we have many characters. We contain multitudes, as Walt Whitman said, and how when we're in a certain nervous system state, that part and the thoughts that originate from that part will kind of co-arise. And so the strategy that most people have by default is they will either argue with the voice in the head, they will feel like they're a victim of the voice in the head, and they'll just try and like get in these endless loops that they can never win. Whereas if you acknowledge that, yes, this is also a function of the state of my nervous system, you can intervene using your physiology, whether it's even things like going for a walk outside, getting in a cold plunge or sauna, or just taking a few breaths, like exhales, feeling your feet and your hands, your feet on the ground. That is often a far more effective way of almost like cutting off the source of where that voice is coming from, as opposed to engaging with whatever the narrative is, which frankly I don't think is a battle that anyone has ever won since the dawn of time. So I think, and something that I've noticed in longer meditation retreats as well, is that even just in periods where there've been no thoughts for however many seconds, when a thought arises, there is a simultaneous, like, very slight tension somewhere in my body. And it's interesting how we're not aware of it most of the time, but there does seem to be some kind of co-arising with subtle tension in the body with thoughts, especially if they're kind of repetitive thoughts that come in a loop. And so I think that's just something very interesting to notice.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been hugely transformational, responding to the mental landscape through the body and the nervous system, and then trying to battle and overcome the thoughts that way. A different changing tact on the battle strategy.
Yeah, I love that. That's, yeah, I think that's the best way. It's so because you can just ignore it. Like, also the phrase of like, don't believe everything you think, realizing that just so many of your thoughts are just random. Like, you also can't predict what the next thought is going to be. It's just arising in your awareness. It's like, okay, it's just like another phenomena. It's like the birds in the sky or anything. And I think having that neutrality and not feeling so over identified with the thoughts that we have. You might have heard this, but my teacher, meditation teacher Michael King, has a great story where his grandma, that he loves very much, was making tea for him, and I can't remember exactly what she said, but the thought that he had was like, fucking hell, grandma, why don't you just hurry up and die? Like, that thought just like came through his mind, and a lot of people would be horrified by that, and he just like laughed. He was like, what a ridiculous thought to have. And I think that it's very healthy, I think, to be able to distance yourself, or at least get curious with humor at whatever the thoughts are that are arising, and not take them too seriously.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I mean, we all have those types of intrusive thoughts sometimes.
Right.
Okay, so just circling back to the area of relationships, I would love to come back to that. How has nervous system work and nervous system mastery impacted your partnership and marriage, and perhaps relationships in general, but perhaps maybe focusing in on the marriage and partnership aspect? How's doing this work supported you?
Yeah. How many hours do we have here? I mean, this could easily be several other podcast episodes, I think. The short answer is an awful lot. I think it both, I mean, I was speaking for myself. First off, I identified a pattern of mine that when there was challenge or conflict, I would kind of withdraw and give this very kind of like stoic, like not give a shit kind of demeanor, but actually it was me just protecting myself and like putting up barriers as opposed to leaning in. And then that would encourage the pattern in my partner to kind of almost be more aggressive and be almost like this kind of like power thing, which is obviously very unhealthy in the long term and isn't really helpful. But identifying that in the beginning and noticing when it was happening, and actually voicing that and speaking, kind of presencing it in real time, and being like, oh, I'm noticing that I'm closing off, and just kind of like inviting in more connection in that moment is really helpful. Practices around really owning my experience the entire time and not projecting or blaming onto my partner is also incredibly helpful, and asking for that in return as well. That's been a lesson for me as well, of like not tolerating when that is being done to me, and almost like enforcing a boundary of like, I want to be here with you in connection, and it's hard for me to stay open when you're blaming me for these things. And so just encouraging yourself and your partner to own their own experience, speaking from the I, saying things like when this happened, I noticed that, or the story that I'm telling myself is ... Because these are objective things that no one can say, oh, you're not having that story. It's like, no, this is a story. It's not true, not necessarily true, but this is something that's coming up for me, is incredibly helpful. And then I'd say, yeah, I mean, there were several times in Bali in particular, when Kelly, whenever she kind of took a period of time away, and when she came back, there was a part in her that wanted to kind of hit the eject button and like throw a bomb and just like obliterate the whole thing. And I think that an earlier version of me that didn't have these nervous system regulation tools would have been so threatened by that, and so, felt so both attacked, betrayed, like why are you being so irrational, all the standard things. And I don't think that I would have been able to stay as present as I did to kind of be with her in that, and to kind of actually be really curious about what her experience was and what was underneath the stories that were being projected, so that we were both ultimately able to kind of be on the same side of the table, is this little phrase that we have, and explore what was there for both of us in the thing that was coming up, and find the generative piece, because usually if there's some often I think the more intense emotions will come through like the female partner, not always the case, but sometimes. And like finding, not necessarily believing the surface level stories, but also acknowledging that there is some deep wisdom here for the partnership to be looked at, to be integrated, and to be explored. So it really is a kind of just, yeah, I think partnership is probably, particularly kind of lifelong committed, or like marriage, is one of the fastest ways to attune your nervous system responses in some ways, because you're both likely getting triggered on a semi-regular basis in small or large ways. And for me as well, learning the difference between like times where she'd come to me with something and like asking, do you want to talk through this on an intellectual level? Is this the problem to solve, or is this more, do you just want to be heard and witnessed and like held in this? And often it's the latter. Often that's kind of what is actually, and for me as well, there's times when that feels really good for me to receive. And that's been one of my learnings as well, is like, I think I've kind of had this story of like, you can always hold space for yourself. Like you've always got enough, but actually learning for the times to ask when like I need to be kind of held or soothed or witnessed in something. And that actually being very helpful for me as well, rather than thinking that I need to like go through everything on my own like a tough man.
Yeah.
Which is helpful in some ways, and it's also very limiting in others. How is this shown up for you guys? I'm really curious to
I mean,
hear how
so many
explored it.
different ways. There was just before I answered that question, there was something that was coming up for me when you were talking about marriage, and it reminded me of a conversation that I was having with my meditation teacher once in Bali, who was a Buddhist monk for 15 years and then went back to the States and got married. And he said, I thought that the spiritual growth would have been in being a monk. He said, marriage was a much bigger spiritual growth for me than living in the monastery. He said everything seemed very easy living in the monastery, and then I come back and it was absolutely trigger central, but in the most beautiful way.
It's like the Ram Dass quote where he's like, you think you're enlightened, let's go spend a week with your parents.
100%.
And I've heard people share similar things about the journey of parenthood as well. And how a guy that I spent a weekend with recently, he had many kind of awakening experiences, but he said that the journey of being and becoming a father was the most profound kind of source of growth for him.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in response to your question, I think the thing that, firstly, there was one phrase in your course which was around being unfit for human consumption, which I think was that a quote from a friend of yours?
It was the same guy actually that talked about the parenthood thing.
Okay, great. Source of all sorts of wisdom then. No, that phrase was really, really helpful for me, and also helpful, for us within partnership, to know that actually, if we've had a bit of a disagreement and I'm feeling all, tense, really activated, angry, I'm actually not going to be the best at coming into co-regulation in that exact moment. So for me,
or you might be terrible.
Okay, well, or terrible. Yeah, exactly.
Maybe
going to be a bit off my game at regulation, let's say. So I think for me, that phrase of, okay, I'm noticing that I'm really unfit for human consumption right now. What do I need in this moment? That's been really helpful in terms of taking responsibility for my own state, or Casper taking responsibility for his own state, so that we can then come back into regulation in, later on in the day or in 5 minutes, whatever needs to happen. But actually, instead of trying to find the outcome of the argument or the trigger or whatever, taking responsibility for the state first and then coming back into co-regulation. I think that was really transformational for us. Also, I think you know, there's understanding the language of your own nervous system, but also what you're kind of pointing to is understanding the language of your partner's nervous system. And I think a
Totally.
big thing for me was, you know, like I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, that when I become very overwhelmed, if something's been a big trigger for me and it maybe puts me into this very early childhood trauma-esque state, I go completely shut down. You know, I go into that dorsal overdrive, and whatever Casper says, he might be trying to work something out with me, and I'll just be mute. I physically won't be able to speak because I'm feeling so overwhelmed in that moment, which was quite a big issue for us in previous arguments before we'd done nervous system work, because he would get even more frustrated, because then he would say, why aren't you communicating with me? It's really unhelpful that you're not even talking back to me. And I would become more and more and more mute, and you're kind of going in opposite directions. But actually, my understanding of what my body's doing, you know, okay, I've gone completely overwhelmed. My body's thinking that I'm about 6 years old right now, so I need to take myself back into adult Megan, sort myself. And Casper's understanding that what's just happened has enabled us to really meet on that kind of co-regulation state. And actually, when I'm in that state, far better for him just to drop whatever it is and be like, you're okay, you're safe right now, come back to that place of safety. And also for him, you know, if he's in a really triggered state, it stopped me from taking things personally in that moment. And being able to be like, okay, right, something's happened. He's in some kind of shame spiral or whatever it is. If I can just put, I'm regulated right now. So if I can put my own pride down in this moment of what he's just said or whatever, and be like, okay, what do you need right now? What can I support you with? Do you need space? I think it's just understanding one another's traits of nervous system and not taking it personally.
And I really love what you just shared. I can really relate to it myself as well. And I think also having the humility at times, like there've been, you know, like there's like one moment I remember from earlier this year where neither of us, I think we were driving and neither of us were regulated, and it was getting to this place where we'd both kind of lost that center. And so I was just like, let's pause. Like this isn't going anywhere, right? Let's just like hit the pause button. When we get home, we'll downshift, and then we'll kind of pick this conversation back up. And I think that's also been a learning for me as well, of like acknowledging the times where I actually don't have capacity to regulate or to receive whatever is kind of coming. And so I think the older version would have been like, yeah, I can, you know, I'll take whatever it is, like I'm strong enough. But actually being attuned to knowing where I am on that regulations scale, and sharing that honestly. And that also takes some, I think, like humility at times as well. But yeah, you're right. Like it's you have to be in constant attunement with yourself and your partner's nervous system. And there is almost this like dance to find connection, and from the place of connection, then exploration into kind of what is actually here, what is trying to come through, what wants to be felt. And there's a phrase that again this same guy Joe Hudson talks about, view, which is being in the state of vulnerability, impartiality, empathy, and wonder. And if you can be in all of those 4 states simultaneously, then kind of beautiful connection will just unfurl. And whenever you notice dropping one of those, like you say, it's like it's a sign that you're at least on the path to being not fit for human consumption. And so it's like, how do I come back to that, or ask for help to come back to that from your partner, and then proceed to or pick off from wherever you left off.
Because that co-regulation is so powerful, right? It's like, you know, so much of this work we do alone, and we get, you know, we can have these tools and practices to bring ourselves into regulation, but actually that co-regulation part is really important too.
It's huge. And I actually wonder if I should emphasize it more in the course that I'm teaching. It's definitely covered, and it's a big piece. But I mean, co-regulation with another grounded nervous system is probably the fastest way to come back into safety and connection. The challenge is, you know, not everyone has access to that. You know, some people live on their own. Even pets, and you know, particularly big dogs, if they're grounded, they can be also really, really helpful and supportive. There've been times when I'll just like go and cuddle our puppy Lola, and that actually feels like I feel myself like really come back into my body in that. nature as well we can kind of co-regulate with. Like there's a reason that forest bathing exists, because I believe that is like another way of saying we are co-regulating with the trees and the environment around us, with lakes and rivers and streams and things. But yeah, I think it's also a large part of the unspoken benefit of seeing a therapist, even if they're not a somatic therapist. If they have a grounded, regulated nervous system, then that presence in itself is beneficial and healing.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what was coming up for me when we were talking about co-regulation. For people who really do struggle to regulate, actually the therapeutic setting just in itself, if you are with a therapist who is very grounded and centered within themselves, and they create that presence and safety for you, that container within itself, even almost without anything even being spoken, just that energetic container is really transformational. And just over time, week by week, session by session, really builds up that capacity, would you say?
Totally. I mean, I'd say, it could be like 70-80% of the work, like that, combined with permissioning, like explicit permission to feel, express, whatever, like everything is welcome. That's most of the work, honestly. And particularly if that is really, felt and received and can be kind of accepted.
Wow, I'm just feeling into that. I'm like, wow, what a co-regulated world we could have if we all just slow down enough for that permission and safety and presence.
It's probably also worth mentioning that the co-regulation works both ways. So if you're working somewhere that is a kind of like quote unquote toxic work environment, and everyone around you is angry, stressed out, and dysregulated, it'll be very hard to keep your center in that as well. Like it's certainly possible, but we are constantly almost like instruments, like tuning ourselves to the nervous systems of the people around us. And so if that is the situation and there's no way to, I've also found that, the more people do come into touch with their interoception and their state, the more their external situations do just shift. Like they might move from the city to somewhere a bit quieter. They might change relationships. They might change jobs. Like these shifts do tend to happen naturally once more attunement comes online. And some people still choose to be in those challenging environments, but just really be disciplined about what they're doing outside of that to kind of compensate.
Yeah, 100%. I can definitely see that during the course of, the last few years, and especially I would say over the last year, my life has become much more simple, very intentionally become much more simple.
Beautiful.
I mean, it doesn't take away the obvious challenges and complexities sometimes that life does throw, but that very intentional simplification. And actually now when people say, and people quite often say to my partner and myself, like, "Oh, you guys are so regulated." I'm like, "Oh, why, thank you."
I love that that's even a phrase that
feels like such a compliment these days.
You guys live in Brighton, so that's probably normal, but most people don't talk that way. Like, wait, regulation, like financial regulation, like what are you talking about?
Taxes, must be that.
Right, yeah. You do your taxes so well.
Thank you, such a compliment. Okay, so just one final question. What for you is the then versus now for having done this work? I mean, we talked about relationships, but how would you say that your life, your lifestyle is different as a result of doing this work?
I almost kind of struggle to relate to the person that I was in my early 20s and before. I actually feel like I've kind of almost become like a fully different person in some ways. So it's almost like a semi-abstract question. But I'd say probably the biggest one is awareness of my own internal landscape. That's probably the number one thing. And actually deliberately listening to it, being curious about it, paying attention to it. And I think probably the piece around the triggers as well. Like I don't, like back then I wouldn't have even had language to know what the response I was was called, I'd just be like, oh, I feel really bad and I want to leave this room of busy people or something, you know, social, like I feel terrible. Like that would have been the extent of it. And now there is this sense of like, I wouldn't say that I deliberately trigger myself or like, but I do put myself into intentionally challenging situations that I feel drawn to, knowing that if there are triggers that arise, that will be ultimately something that I'll be grateful for in hindsight, even if, as you say, it feels a bit crap at the time. And the second piece I'd say is yeah, it's definitely around relationships. I think that I struggle to find really, again, I wasn't really fully aware of this at the time, but I think I felt very lonely for a lot of my childhood and in my early 20s, but I wasn't really sure why. I just felt like a little bit lost, a little bit lonely. And I think that the nervous system tools and practices and journey have given me the capacity to feel more connection to myself and crucially cultivate more meaningful relationships, friendships, and now a marriage.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would love for you just to finish off with what you have coming up, your offerings, about your course. When is the next cohort? How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, thank you. This has been really fun. I've really enjoyed this.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, if people are curious, we're running our 4th cohort in late September. Applications are officially open. And if you have any questions, my email is johnny@curioushumans.com. I'm pretty active on Twitter. It's Jonny M1LLER. It's a bit of a weird Twitter handle, but please feel free to get in touch there. I also have some resources and kind of links that I can share as well. But yeah, would love to have you join us. If you listen to the end of this conversation and what we've just talked about, my sense is it would probably be a good fit for the training. We have a really great community, so yeah, I'd love to see you there.
Amazing. Anything else that you would like to share today, Jonny?
No, I've just really appreciated this conversation, and yeah, it's really cool to kind of have these types of conversations with other people who've almost had this kind of like before and after experience. And I'm like also like mapping it to my own experience as well. So I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and your wisdom. There's so much of it. So I'm glad that we managed to encapsulate an hour of it.
Yeah, this has been really fun.
Oh, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed that conversation and had some significant takeaways to understand yourself a little better and give you some insight and tools in how to create more calm and agency for yourself within daily life. The links to follow or get in touch with Jonny are in the show notes, as well as a link to his nervous system mastery course. The next cohort begins on September 25th, and I'd strongly recommend to anyone interested in taking this work further. Please do share this episode with anyone you feel would benefit from it. In this case of this particular episode, that probably applies to pretty much everyone that you know, but the sharing does help this information to get to people who could be best supported by it. And if you enjoy the podcast in general, please do take a moment to rate, review, or follow. I'd love to hear any reflections or takeaways, so do feel free to get in touch with me via my website, higher-love.com, or via my Instagram at higherlove_with Megan. Until next time, big love.